Hello everybody. Today we're going to have some fun and we're going to create an artwork with a little robin. So here is my reference photograph. I'm going to be working on the paint on paper, the Clairefontaine paint on, which is just a nice good general purpose drawing paper. You could work on any other white good quality thick enough paper. Don't choose anything too thin. A hot pressed watercolor would be fine, but for the purposes of this exercise, the Clairefontaine paint on is a nice paper on which to work. Now we are going to have a little bit of optional fun at the end, should you want to have it, should you feel it would be quite enjoyable. We're going to put our little robin into a hole. Not literally. We're going to draw the piece of torn paper like this. So this is the reference, and you're going to see how we do it. It's basically trompe-l'oeil, excuse me, I'm not very good at French, but it's basically tricking the eye. It's going to look as if your little robin is popping out of a hole in a piece of paper, just as a little bit of fun. Some of you may have done the A bird exercise before, and so you will be quite familiar with the technique. And this just shows you how you can add a little variety. There you can see I have drawn up my robin from my reference, and I have also drawn up the piece of paper from my photographic reference, and you're going to see how we're going to progress through it. These are the pencils that you are going to need. There's quite an array. You could possibly do without some of them, but I'll go through them anyhow. They're quite familiar colors for anyone who's done previous videos. There's nothing sort of wacky about any of the colors. You're going to need a white, and you're going to need a black. They all come from the Faber Castell Polychromos range. However, you can obviously use whatever range you prefer. Ivory. I would suggest that you are also going to need a warm grey 2 or 3. Warm grey 2 or 3. It really doesn't make that much difference. Warm grey 5. Dark sepia. A little tickle of cinnamon. So it wouldn't be desperate if you didn't have the cinnamon, but I'm going to put a little tickle of cinnamon in the legs, just to add a bit of variety. Oops, I nearly dropped that. You're going to use dark cadmium orange, light cadmium red, burnt sienna, some brown ochre, and also some Van Dyke brown. So that gives you quite a nice range. Obviously, you're welcome to include anything else, but that is a nice simple range, and you'll be able to do the robin using those colors. As I usually recommend with colored pencil, I prefer to work light through to dark, because I'm aware that as I lay in the feathers, I run the risk of losing some of my light, some of my liveliness, and you want to maintain that feather texture. Let's just bring the reference across. It's not terribly well lit, this, but we'll be able to work our way around that. But you can see the lively featheriness, and you don't want to lose that. So let's get started by we're going to be working with white and with ivory. Underneath the little red breast, I am going to put a layer of ivory. Now, I'm not just going to put it any old how. I'm going to lay it in a crissy-crossy manner. I'm going to turn my piece of paper over to show you what I mean. When you're putting in the feather, you don't want to be too even, because if you put those initial layers of feather in too even, the bird is inclined to look too stiff. So by crissy-crossy, I mean if that is the main direction of feather growth, you want to go just crissy-crossy, just a few degrees off. As you are laying it in, it's just slightly crissy-crossy, so that it ends up, your initial layer ends up looking really untidy. And that's exactly what you want. You do need a sharp point. I have done it with the brown ochre so that you can see it, because if I were to do it with white on the white paper, you wouldn't be able to see it. Okay, underneath the little red breast, I'm going to use ivory because I know I want a little warmth underneath there. So nice sharp point, and I'm going to go crissy-crossy. You may find you want to just flick, and that's fine. I prefer to keep the pencil on the paper and do a very short crissy-crossy stroke. It's almost like an untidy coloring. You can just see it appearing because I'm using the ivory. You really do need a sharp point though. The sharper the point, the better the result is going to be. Now, as you lay it in, do not lay it in too smoothly. All you have to do is follow feather growth direction. Keep the stroke really short, and you want to be able to see a little bit of the white paper through your stroke. Now, I know that is really challenging when you are working with such pale colors, but it honestly is so helpful to do it in this manner because it just sets the scene. Let's twist it around. I'm still thinking of where the feather is growing from. It grows from the beak and outwards so that the bird is a bit aerodynamic. Nice little short strokes, crissy-crossy. Notice I keep twisting my pencil because then it keeps my point sharper for longer. When I start to add the strokes up here, I want to be particularly short. And I know it's quite a challenge to see, but that's what I am doing, is this tiny short little stroke. I'm not pressing terribly hard, but equally I'm making sure I have enough pencil on the paper. You'll understand why in a little while. Now I'm going to leave that and move on to white. And the rest of the bird, I'm actually going to put a layer of white using exactly the same stroke. So it's the short, crissy-crossy stroke. By short, I mean a short stroke. Don't make a long stroke like that. Remember, you're doing short feathers. They're tiny. Bird is more or less life size. So you want this crissy-crossy, crissy-crossy. But you're not going wild. You're not cross-hatching. Let me just turn it over again. Remember, you're just going off. I just needed a point. You're just going off the direction. So you're just going crissy-crossy, crissy-crossy, crissy-crossy. You're not making cross-hatching. That's not good. Okay, that's going to be far too extreme. You just want crissy-crossy, crissy-crossy, crissy-crossy. So it's not a difficult stroke, obviously, but it's maybe a little different and something a little unusual that you aren't quite used to yet. So you just want to go every part of the bird that has got a fluffiness to it. That's where you particularly are going to make sure you've got this lively, crissy-crossy stroke. But I do emphasize sharp point. That's blunt. That's better. Because if you don't have a sharp point, your resulting line is too fuzzy. And if it's fuzzy, you're not going to get the actual benefits of this crissy-crossy stroke. And a fuzzy point is inclined to fill in all the gaps, and you don't want all the gaps filled in. Once we've put lots of layers on, you're going to find the gaps fill in anyway. Now, if you are doing this exercise, I do recommend doing the bird first before you actually do the trompe-l'oeil effect, should you want to. Remember, that is an optional extra. It's not essential at all. You could happily have your little bird sitting on a branch of your choice, or as in your photographic reference, sitting on a bird bath. It wouldn't be a problem at all. You can see I have just changed this foot a little bit because I felt I needed it to curl around my piece of paper. I say piece of paper in inverted commas, obviously. And I'm going to do exactly the same at the top here. Little crissy-crossy, short strokes at the top of the head, keeping an eye on my pencil point, and as soon as it starts to get blunt, I sharpen it. That's borderline. So there we go again. Nice little short strokes. All the parts that are generally quite fluffy, where you can't see the actual definition of feathers, as on the flight feathers, you're going to need to put this stroke in with a fair bit of pressure, but you're not exhausting yourself. Now I'm going to, as I work my way down, I'm actually going to put some of this very familiar stroke now on all those feathers too. Not that it is going to be that noticeable by the time I have built everything up, but it does just add a subtle liveliness. So whilst I'm doing it, I may as well just run all over them, but it wouldn't be an essential, particularly because the bird is in this position. You're not going to see much of the wing, you're not going to see the tail. It would depend on your bird. If you were doing one that showed more of the flight feathers, you would probably have to be a little more cautious. So that's your first layer. The legs are a sort of a light pinkish grey, according to my reference. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put the merest tickle of cinnamon over the legs. Just a tickle, a really gentle tickle. But bear in mind, if you don't have cinnamon, you could just put a little bit of grey. You could make the legs greyer rather than having a subtle pink underlayer. It wouldn't be the end of the world. Always bear in mind when you are doing an artwork is what is actually the purpose of the artwork. This is decorative. Obviously, it's a robin coming through a piece of paper. It's not designed to be a biological study or an ornithological study. It's a bit of fun. Oh, I think I put that wrong. I was just looking at I've gone and put some pink where I shouldn't have put pink. Never mind. There you go. There, I found my eraser. That's actually part of the paper behind. Fortunately, if you lay in things as gently as I prefer to lay in early on in the process, you will find that they are generally extremely easy to erase, and you can make corrections, and that will eventually be fine. It will make sense. Okay, on my beak, because my beak is generally sort of a really dark grey black, I'm just going to put a little layer of light grey. Remember, I'm working light through to dark, as I always do, because I find it the safer option. If you put in the darks too soon, in my opinion, you run the risk of making a mess. And if you have gone wrong, it's really difficult to get rid of those darks. And I'm going to put also a layer of Van Dyke brown over the eye. Now, if you look at the photographic reference, and this happens often with small little birds, the eye looks pitch black. It's not pitch black. It will always have an iris color. Now, in the robin, it might be a really dark gray. It might be a really dark brown. Remember, you're doing this as an artwork. And so I'm going to put some Van Dyke brown in the eye because my eye is going to be really dark brown. You don't have to press too hard, but you want a decent enough layer. You want the eye to look brown. And it is a dark brown, but it's not going to be just dead black. So that's going to be your starting point. You've prepared everything. You've got all the lights down first. You know that that's going to be a red breast, but we've put something light down first, and you'll see as I progress along the reason behind that. Right, now we're going to continue on and start adding some color. Hopefully you'll be able to see the logic behind putting the ivory first when I put my layer of dark cadmium orange. Now I could have started with yet a lighter orange if I'd wanted to, but I think this will be sufficient. You need a nice sharp point. Sorry, the battery operated sharpeners just chomped the pencil. Never mind, I have a handy manual one. Okay, nice sharp point, and you're going to use exactly the same stroke. And you're going to go crissy-crossy all over your ivory. So it's exactly the same stroke as what you've been using. And what you should see happening is the fact that the ivory will have repelled or will repel the orange just slightly. And by doing this untidy stroke, crissy-crossy, I'm already creating a feathery texture, which is really, really helpful. Let me just show you at the back of the piece of paper again. If I've put down a layer of ivory, and then I put some orange over the top, very subtly, it's not, you can't see it that easily, but very subtly, the ivory just repels the orange slightly so that it breaks it up a little bit. And as I apply the extra stroke, my orange is inclined to fall into the gaps that have been left by the ivory, and that's why just every so often you'll get a darker spot of orange, and that just adds a little bit of unevenness. It's subtle, it's not going to yell at you, you don't want it to yell at you, but it is just there. Do remember, however, you need a sharp point at all times. I know I sound a bit like a stuck record, but honestly you do. If you go in with a blunt point, the whole effect becomes too fuzzy too quickly. And I am working quite gently. You don't need to work too hard. You don't need to press too hard. It's quite a delicate stroke that you are applying. We've got quite a number more layers to put on. Another reason why I did the ivory first is because it gives me a little bit more yellowness, which is no bad thing. You want that sort of yellowy orange coming through. You can see how in places there is a definite unevenness, and that is exactly what you want. You don't want it to be too neat. That's one of the most tricky things when you are working with colored pencil, is that things can become too neat. You are working with a sharp point and you are working in an exacting manner. And the resulting work can become too neat, and it's quite a challenge to not let it be too neat. Right, so as a first layer, that looks absolutely fine. I've still got that lively crissy-crossiness. I still have some gaps. I might even have some gaps that go through to the white paper, but I certainly have some gaps that go through to the ivory. So I don't want a neat layer. It looks a bit scruffy. Just run with it at this stage. Okay, so now we want to go in with some gray. And I'm going to go in with my warm gray 3. So wherever the bird has got some gray showing through, I'm going to use my warm gray 3, and in a similar manner, I know I'm going to have to go a little darker, but I don't want to actually lose the light. That's always the challenge, is don't lose the light. You can almost see this unevenness working better with the white. As I put in this light crissy-crossy stroke, you can see in places how where there is no white pencil, the gray is falling into those gaps and it's taking a little more strongly. And that's immediately created quite a decent feather texture. So it's a very useful technique, this, for birds as well as for animals, particularly very small animals, mice, finer details that you're doing perhaps on a rabbit or something like that. It really is a useful technique. So I'm putting a little grey down here as well. Notice at this stage, I am not thinking about tonal value. In other words, I'm not thinking about where my shadows go. All I'm doing is thinking about the local color. The shadows are going to come later. Now there's quite a nice large area, and you can see these dark spots all over the place. And that's exactly what you want to achieve if possible. Right, let's get some brown on. And the same principle applies. I am going to work with the lighter brown. So I'm going to work with brown ochre. Now you might prefer to work with something like Bista or any other light brown you have. But I'm going to use brown ochre because it's quite a common color. I use it a lot. So some of you who may have been following the videos should already have it. You won't have had to buy another color. And again, the crissy-crossiness, and look at these lovely spots that are appearing. With an exercise like this, you are not going for evenness. If you've done some of the flower videos, you will find that we talk about even lay-in and so on. Whereas this, we really don't want an even lay-in. We want it quite jiggedy-jaggedy, crissy-crossy, the odd dark spot coming through, because that's what makes it effective. Right, you can see that's slowly starting to take shape. And I'm going to do exactly the same on these wings. Although I know I've got a slightly different technique on the wings, I'm just going to get a bit of color on everything. Quite gently on the wings at this early stage. So he's really taking shape quite quickly now. I'm going to go in with my darker grey. I think I'll go in with the darker grey. And I'm just going to put a tickle of darker grey over the pink. Not everywhere. This is the only place I'm now starting to think a little bit about tone, in as much as I'm thinking the shadows are going to have a little bit of the grey, and any of the features. Just a tickle. It's such early days still, but I'm just wanting to put another layer, more or less, on everything. Now, if you are going to do this exercise again, perhaps with a different bird or whatever, I do recommend doing the bird or the animal first, mainly because you'll see when we get onto the trompe-l'oeil, it's easy to smudge it. And it really does make it easier just to do the actual bird first, or the animal first. You might want to do it with another animal, perhaps. Right, so I've just got, the color is now a little more accurate on the legs. It's because their legs are not pink, but there definitely appears to be a pinkish undertone. So the color is a bit more accurate. The toenails are pretty dark. I'll put those in later. I could put a little of the darker grey on the beak as well, mostly on the lower beak, because that obviously is going to be the shadowed section as opposed to the upper beak being shadowed. So that gives you your next step. Quite simple, just building up the layers of pencil. We're going to start working with the darker red. And this is the light cadmium red, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to go over the whole thing again using the darker red, not pressing too hard, but what I'm doing is I'm building up the layers. Colored pencil loves to be layered, and the more layers you can put on within reason, the better. And you can see I'm just intensifying everything, but I'm not putting it too hard because I don't want to lose my lights. And if you notice, if you look really closely, you will see there's still very tiny little bits of light creeping through. And that's really what you want. These tiny little bits of light that, although I'm now putting a third layer on, I can still see these tiny little bits of light creeping through. And it's mainly because my pencil is super sharp. I'm not pressing too hard, and I'm doing this rather untidy coloring, this crissy-crossy stroke. That's getting a bit blunt now. I know that sounds awfully pedantic, but it honestly is. For a small bird, if you were doing a larger bird, like a great big eagle, you would have a little more flexibility to work with a slightly blunter point if you were desperate to do so. But for a small bird like this, to maintain the lights, you really do want a nice sharp point. This little crissy-crossy, as I get closer to the eye, the stroke is even shorter. And just putting in the local color. Right, now I'm going to do exactly the same, work my way around. I'm going to work with the darker gray here because I had used the lighter gray. So I'm going in with the darker gray, but I'm not using a lot of pressure. Do remember when you are doing this stroke, you can always go back and add more. If inadvertently you have made your crissy-crossies a little too untidy, which can happen, don't worry about it, because you honestly can go back and add another layer or two even, and that will often just pull the strokes together. So rather be a little too lively, if anything, I think. Sorry, I just see a spot there that I've missed the darker red just around his eye. So you can see I'm relatively cautious as I'm laying in these colors because I know I can easily darken, and I still have to consider the tonal value and so on and so forth, which pulls it all together. But I do not want to go too dark too soon. And here again, you can see by putting in this crissy-crossy, there's still these nice dark marks that are popping through, and that just adds the liveliness. Right, let me go in with my Van Dyke brown over the top of the lighter brown. So you keep it relatively simple. There's no need to add thousands of colors, in my opinion. You want to keep it relatively simple. And you're working with 2 reds, 2 oranges, and you're working with 2 browns, and you're working with 2 grays. So you are keeping it reasonably simple. Now, before I go and put my darker brown here, I don't want to lose all my detailing that I did put in. So I'm just going over using a dark sepia, which is a really useful color. I have a feeling there's extra feathers there anyway. I'm just going over all these very fine lines that I had in, and just so that I don't lose them, just bumping them up slightly. Remember, I am doing certainly it reasonably accurately, but do remember this is not an ornithological study. So if I am slightly inaccurate, I don't think it's going to matter in an artwork. So I'm going over all the brown, the light brown, with this gentle crissy-crossy stroke. And again, you can still see the variation coming through. It's really a lot of the same when you are doing a bird. And I suppose your biggest challenge is patience and a sharp point. And you can see these dark marks, and that is good. So you might initially think, oh my goodness, I've gone untidy. No, that's absolutely fine, because really and truly it'll pull together as we add these extra strokes. You will notice the difference. I'm using the Van Dyke Brown. The eye was done in Van Dyke Brown. Look how different it looks now because I've got the lighter brown underneath. I know that sounds an obvious sort of thing, but it is worthwhile just mentioning it. Right, so this is progressing along quite nicely. Now, one thing you may be aware of is we've got texture all over here. But what about the belly part? We've not got much texture. Now, a lot of that is really quite white, but we can't leave it white. You've got to be able to see the texture. And so what we are going to do, we've gone and put a layer of white, remember, in an uneven, crissy-crossy fashion. So what we're going to do now at this stage, and I leave it until this stage so that you can see it. You can see the texture here, here, and here, and yet there's nothing. And so we're going to go in with the warm grey 2, and even though that is particularly white, you still need texture. So if I go in with the warm grey 2, not pressing too hard, and all I'm doing is continuing with this crissy-crossy stroke, and I'm putting a layer of warm grey 2 over everything. Now that I know is supposed to be white, but you do need the tonal value. You still do need the texture. So because I'm working with a light grey, it just gives me enough texture. You will see as I add the extra tonal values later that it doesn't darken it too much. And the illusion is still going to be white or pretty close to it. And yet now I also have texture on the belly part. And that's really quite important. And you can see again how some of the grey is falling into the gaps that I left behind when I applied the white, and that's good. So there's our little robin now at the next stage. Now we need to start thinking a little bit more about tonal value and pulling it together with a bit more detailing. We're going to start with the eye. I've put in the basic color of the eye, but now we want to actually complete the eye. When you are doing any eye, I do find it's useful to make sure you've got the outer shape quite correct and well defined. I know that sounds obvious, but sometimes it's a step that's easily missed. So I'm using black and I'm making sure the outer edge is well defined. Then I'm going to do my tried and tested eye recipe, mainly because I find it works. It's nothing terribly fancy, but I find it's very effective. So first things first, you put the pupil in the middle of the iris. Now, I know that sounds obvious, but you really do want the pupil in the middle of the iris. You don't want it too far forward. You don't want it too far back, especially a little bird like this. So you still want to see iris color all the way around. Now, I'm using black for that. Because I've got a layer of brown down, and by using black over the top, it means it's not going to be a bottomless pit. If I used black and put brown around it, the black is on the white, and it just somehow doesn't quite look so good. I'm just tweaking the corner of the eyes. You may not need to, but I just looked and thought I did need to. Okay, I now need to darken the top 1/3. You need to darken it horizontally, right? And darken it with a straight line. Then I'm going to blend to halfway. Now I am aware that, of course, a little robin doesn't have a huge eyelid that is really casting much of a shadow. But it just seems to look better if you do the recipe to completion. I'm blending to halfway quite gently. Now I'm using black for all of that because the iris color is so dark. Now I need to consider my light source direction. I usually light my work from the left, and so because of that I'm going to put the highlight in the eye. I'm using a white milky pen. This particular make is Jelly Roll. There are many around. You look for a white highlighter pen, a pigment ink. It goes by all sorts of names. It's basically a ballpoint pen with white ink inside. They can be extremely irritating because they're full of white ink and then they suddenly decide they're going to stop working. This one, fortunately, is still working. So I'm going to put my highlight. I'm keeping it reasonably small. And I put the highlight where the iris and the pupil meet for no other reason than I like it there. What happens is the light then shines down through the eyeball, which is a fluid-filled object. And because my light is diagonal, my highlight at the bottom of the iris will be just slightly diagonal too, just off center really a bit. And I'm using the white just to very subtly lighten that section of the eye, the white pencil, not the pen. And I find that that really simple recipe works. There are lots of other ways of doing eyes, and as you grow in experience and you try different ways, you can well come up with 101 different ones. I like that recipe because of its simplicity and the fact that I know it's going to work. I now want to do the beak. I've got my eye, which is my darkest dark so far when I look at the entire robin. I now need to do the beak. The beak is quite small, so I don't want to overdo it. Right. I need to make sure I've got the gape in, and the gape is where the two beaks meet. So with black, I'm just going to draw that gape in. It can be quite tricky keeping your hand steady so that you get a straightish line. And because the beak is basically black, I'm going to use just black. It's such a small beak, you don't want to go and put too many colors in. I know that the shadow has to be at the bottom. And I'm going to tickle that shadow upwards, but I'm going to try, if possible, to leave a little highlight, just a tiny little highlight at the bottom of the gape. There's my gape in black, there's my shadow underneath, and then there's this tiny little highlight. It's only subtle, and I really don't need to do much burnishing on the beak unless it looks very streaky, but I don't think it does so far. I'm going to do the same on the top beak, but I'm working just more gently. And I'm going to try and leave a tiny little highlight along the top as well. So my gape then there's highlights on each side. And the only reason I do that is because it actually gives the viewer a bit of something else to look at. Now, some birds' beaks don't show that at all, and they fold down and do all sorts of various things. And obviously, if you're doing a larger bird, you've got to look a lot more closely at the actual reference. I am tickling the black. I don't want too much black at the top here. I want a highlight at the top. All I need to do then, I really do not need to overwork my beak. It's so tiny. I'm not even going to burnish it. Normally I burnish if I want to smooth things out, but to me the application looks smooth enough. All I want to do is put the nostril in, so I'm just using the black again, pressing a little harder. And that is the beak, done and dusted. Keep it simple if you don't need to do anything more complicated. Now we're going to start thinking tonal value for the rest, because this is what helps pull the whole thing together. We've got a nice enough textured little bird there, but it's flat. So we need a lot of tonal value in there to help it pull together. And this is where I use the dark sepia. And within the red area, I'm also going to use the burnt sienna, because the burnt sienna, being a reddish brown, can be extremely useful. So first and foremost, from the beak area, because I need to link the beak and the eye to the entire body. It looks a bit weird at the moment. Dark, dark, and the rest is kind of like in no man's land. So from this beak area with a super sharp dark sepia, I'm almost working from the dark of the beak with tiny, tiny little flicks. And I'm just pulling a little bit of shadow, well, darkness from the beak up into the feather. I'm talking about a millimeter. And I'm going to do exactly the same at the bottom, except at the bottom, my stroke can be fractionally longer because the lower beak is casting a shadow. So it can just be slightly longer. Now, you will notice I'm flicking, and the reason I'm doing that is because I want a little more detail. And I think the untidy coloring stroke that I had been using is not going to give me quite sufficient detail. So you can see I've put a fair bit more shadow now under the throat. I've got to be careful. That to me is looking a little bit too dark. I've been a bit exuberant. I wasn't thinking as I was going along. The joy is, because I have got a whole lot of light layers underneath, if that is too dark, whilst it's a bit of a chore, I actually can erase, not necessarily all of it, but most of it. If I do have to do that, I must go back and put some ivory first, and then my two reds. And then I am back to a subtle darkness under the chin, but not too much. Right? You do lose a little bit of the liveliness, but it's not the end of the world. You know I made a bit of a botch, but if somebody just looked at the artwork, they wouldn't know. Okay, so now I need to consider some eyelids. I'm still using the dark sepia. To help separate out the eye from the fluff, I'm just putting in that tiny little bit of lid and flicking from it. Just tiny little flicks. On a bird's face, obviously there are features, but they're quite tricky to see. So your application has to be super delicate. Again, there, a little bit of a darkness, leaving a lightness, and then I'm going to flick. Sometimes it's preferable to use a darker pencil, like the dark sepia, than use a lighter pencil and have to press hard. Because the dark sepia is such a dark color, it means I can really just touch the surface of the paper. Let's see how that's starting to look. You can see now the beak and the eye are starting to link together with the rest of the fluff. Let me go in with a little bit of my burnt sienna. And I'm just going to add a little bit more. As I'm flicking these strokes in, the flicks are quite widespread. They're not particularly close together, but I am considering, as I'm doing it, the crissy-crossy nature of what I have already laid in. I don't want to darken the red particularly, but I do need to show some depth. And adding a little bit of dark is really important for showing depth to the feather. Right, I'm going to work my way around on the red bit. Remember, the light is coming from the upper left, according to the reference of my eye. That means that everything that starts to go downhill, lower, is darker. But I don't need anything too dark. So I'm just going in with burnt sienna and I'm just flicking in quite a widespread manner, a few darks. And you will see as I work my way along how that helps the feather develop some depth. I think I can increase the dark down here a bit. Now I'm careful because I've already made a botch and had to rub it out. So I'm just being a little more cautious. If I suddenly keep quiet, you know the brain is kicking in. As you do that, if you feel the need, it's always good practice to get into, is over the top of some of your tonal value. Remember, that's a tonal tool. It's brown, it's not orangey red. A few extra flicks of the darker or the lighter red over some of the actual tonal tool is really quite good. With colored pencil being transparent, you can alter the brown just subtly by putting a little bit of your base color over it again. But do be careful how you're putting it on. You don't want to flatten the texture to any great extent. Right, let's just continue to work this up a bit because I'm sure there should be a little bit more of a dent down here. Very, very gently. And notice I am flicking this way and that. So that, and again, I'm not flicking evenly. Let me just turn this over a minute. I'm really trying to achieve something like this, but I'm flicking it. So I'm flicking this way and that, and I'm varying my flicks. If that's the main direction, I'm going this way and that. Flick, 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 flick. Short little flicks, really quite gently, so that I'm developing something quite similar to that. Nothing looks too neat, but it does need to be applied with a fair bit of tact. And this is another reason why I like to work light through to dark, because as I'm putting these darker tones in, I can control them so much more than if I were doing it if I'd put the darks in to begin with. I'm not saying that it's always the only way to do it, but it's how I do it, and how I particularly do little birds, where I want to keep the liveliness. You can see how just by adding this little bit of dark, and it's very gentle, it's immediately changing the whole of that red section, and it's making it look a whole lot more realistic. As I go along, I'm going to again go back with my darker red, which is only my light cad red. It's not very dark. and just put a few extra flicks over my tonal tool. But I'm careful that I don't smooth things out too much, and that can happen easily. So do be extra cautious. This gentle flicking probably takes longer than all the other parts, especially for this bird on the little red breast. As we work our way down the bottom there, you'll see it's not quite as exacting, but you do want to be quite careful here because it's such a feature. But I'm just tickling it in. And if I look at that now, suddenly I've not done anything else to the red, but suddenly these extra little tweaks of dark have just given a little bit of depth to the red, the illusion that the feather is just not on the top, it actually goes down. So these little darks are really telling the viewer that you know there is a depth to the feather. And that's what you are showing. Right, so on the head and on the back, as I work my way down, I'm going to use the dark sepia. I'm using the dark sepia in the grey. I know I worked with dark grey here, but if I have to press very hard with the dark grey, I'm going to lose that liveliness. So to continue the same sort of stroke, just by using a little bit of dark sepia over the grey, allows me to develop the depth in the grey without losing the liveliness. And because I was using warm grey and I'm using dark sepia, the two work together particularly well. Now I'm quite mindful of the top of the head not becoming too dark. And the main reason is because I'm going to add a trompe-l'oeil effect. You may not be adding one, and in which case you could always darken the top of the head slightly if you preferred. But I know I'm going to add the trompe-l'oeil effect, and because of that, I don't want to go too dark on the top of the head because the background is going to be very dark and I need the top of the head to show up. So I'm doing exactly the same thing. I'm just tickling in this extra little bit of dark. And suddenly that feather all starts to link together. So I'm just very tactfully tickling that in with a few extra strokes. Many times you don't need much more than just a few extra strokes. You can see I've developed that dark area now, but it was literally a few extra strokes. As I work my way down the back here, I can add the dark sepia, not hard, but a little more vigorously, because of the fact that this is going to develop into my shadow side. My light is coming upper left, and so anything that's to the right or lower right is going to be slightly darker. But I don't want it to be too dark or dead, or sort of, when I say dead, lacking texture. I still want to keep the texture, but it can be tonally a little darker. So tiny, short, repetitive little strokes with a nice sharp point will just develop the texture and the tone, so that when I start to look at it now, the eye is not jumping out at me. There are similar tones throughout the bird, even though they may only be in a really small area. It suddenly starts to come together quite nicely. And we do exactly the same here on this grey area. And this is now the start of the wing. So I might have a little bit more structure coming through. You can see that by just literally doing that line, in a flicked stroke, I suddenly have a little wing that's coming forward. And so I'm going to just very tactfully darken behind it, because by darkening behind it, I allow that part to be lighter. And that means it's going to stick out a bit. So it's little strokes. Remember, you don't want to go too dark or too hard at this stage. I can always darken further later. So I'm just tickling it through gently. Okay, we now need to start putting some tonal value at the bottom here. I will do the wing in a minute. That's a slightly different technique. And again, how much of that you want to do or not is up to you. So I'm going to start off. I've got, remember, my warm grey 4 there. No, it wasn't warm grey 4. It was warm grey 2. I'm going to go in with my warm grey 5 as well as, if needed, the warm grey 3. But we'll just see. So I'm going to start with my warm grey 5. And at the bottom here, very, very gently, I'm just going to, this slightly dark line that I have, I'm just going to pull it up slightly higher. Still with that crissy-crossy stroke, super sharp point, and just a flick this way and that way. This part I'm going to try and leave quite pale at this stage. Now, it's quite a challenge to get the darker colors to blend into the lighter colors when you are using this flicked stroke. And this is where I may find that my warm grey 3 is helpful, because it just gives me that slight subtle blend. So it's, again, it's always the same stroke. So when in colored pencil, when you're talking about blending, there's many different ways of blending. Sometimes it's laying in the pencil very smoothly and blending it in that fashion. Other times it's blending with a flick, which is what I'm doing here. I'm layering it in, but I'm flicking it in at the same time. Very, very gently. I would rather go back and put other strokes if I need to, and an extra layer even if I need to. It's going to be the development of the darks that's going to maintain that light area. So let's continue on a little bit further. Remembering to flick this way and that way, because it really does help with the unevenness that you're trying to create. It is a challenge when you're doing a little bird like this to smooth it out too much and make the feather all look just a bit too smooth. Not that it's really right or wrong, because to be fair, it's your own personal interpretation. But I personally do like to try and maintain as much feather texture as I can. And slowly that's starting to pull together. It's no longer just that line. Remember, it started off looking just like that. But now with careful flicking of my dark grey, that line is disappearing. Now, in this particular artwork, I can darken this section a fair bit because I'm doing the trompe-l'oeil effect. And because of that, this side is behind my piece of paper and so disappears and is going to be more shadowed. I may even find once I do the piece of paper, I may need to darken it even further. But I know I can actually make this a little darker. Right, let's have a look and see how that looks. That's looking absolutely fine so far. This part is more shadowed, and so I didn't have to worry too much about using my other grey. Okay, now we need to consider these wings. And we need to consider stronger tonal value. Right, here we've got a little bit of the dark sepia coming in. Remembering that this wing is casting a shadow on the feather beneath it. Now I'm putting that in with a dark line, which might horrify some of you, but what I usually do is I put the line in and then I work from it. So from there, I am then going to flick into the grey using the dark sepia, and I am blending that line by flicking. If I keep flicking it, I'm not going to create a smooth blend. I'm going to have a lively blend. Let's just turn it around, and you can see now that wing appears to stand more proud because of the fact that I have got that darker tone underneath. Sometimes you have to be brave with the darks just to get them in, to give you that really good three-dimensional effect. Without the darks, there's never the illusion of light, and it is the lights and the darks that give you shape and form. So it's a really important, your tonal value is all important, always. Right, now to help me blend that dark down a bit, I'm reverting to my grey. And again, it's a few random flicks. Remember how I developed that? It really was just a few random flicks. And this as well, a few random flicks optically helps blend that down quite easily. But by keeping the flicking stroke, it means that I'm keeping that feathery texture. Okay, I now need to do my flight feathers. I'm not going to overdo the detail, because if I look overall at this artwork, that is definitely my focal point. The lower part of the back is not my focal point. Again, it would depend if you were doing this as another exercise and you were using a different photograph. You might have a different emphasis, but in this particular one, that is the emphasis. So I've got a fair bit of detailing here on each wing, and you may or may not want to bump up any of that. I'm going to be working mostly with the dark sepia, but I'm going to be working quite gently so that I can control what it is I'm doing. Remember, these are small little features at the back here, and although you want it reasonably believable, you honestly are not working for a huge amount of detail. All I think about is every wing that is on top casts a subtle shadow underneath. You can see that little wing there, that little feather cast a shadow underneath, and this one here as well. So my dark that I'm putting in is quite subtle. These feathers here become so close together as to be hardly noticeable. So I'm just tickling a little bit of dark. I'm trying to keep a couple of these on the tip here reasonably light. Remember at the beginning I said never lose the lights? And so by just adding a little bit of dark as this feather recedes backwards behind what is going to be a piece of paper, I've managed to keep that lightness and a little bit of variety too for the viewer. Here I've got a little more detail coming through, so it's a case of underneath each little feather I'm putting a bit of dark, but it's so tiny as to really, you're not going to see all the detail. You really, really won't. But it's in your mind, you know what it is that you are doing, so that when the viewer looks, it kind of makes sense to them, even if this is not accurate enough to be an ornithological study, which it certainly isn't. it at least makes sense and it doesn't look peculiar. So you can see I'm literally just tickling in small amounts of the dark sepia. I know I'm not likely to lose the light because I put light brown down first before I put the Van Dyck brown down. So I have quite a number, and of course I've got white underneath that too. So I have quite a number of lighter colors down first, and that means that I should be fine. I shouldn't lose my lights. Let's just turn that around. You can see that that is working perfectly adequately for the amount of detail that I need in this particular study. Any marks that I make, I just consider the whole time, think about that crissy-crossy stroke so that nothing looks too smooth, because I am trying to create a feathery effect. Let's just have a look there. I think that looks fine. I could probably just add a small amount more dark on this side. Just a tickle. And again, I'm still putting it in that crissy-crossy stroke, be it flicked or be it slightly colored. And that's looking fine. I now need to do the feet, and I'm quite careful with the feet because they're very small. I don't want them to get too clumsy. What I am going to do with the feet, I wouldn't say it's a proper burnish, but I am going to put a layer, because I want to just smooth them out. I am going to put a layer of, I think I might put white, just a layer of white over the color that I have laid in already. So it's not really like a major blanket burnish that you would do on a larger object. I'm just putting a layer of white, mainly because I've got to be careful. I don't want to lose the light, not even on the legs. So by just squishing down that pink and grey a little bit, I've just sort of maintained it. Birds' feet are quite a challenge, apart from the shape of them, because they're so tiny. Especially if you're working more or less life size, they are small. Okay, we'll start off with the toenails. The bird is not quite finished. I need a bit more dark at the back here, but I'm going to do the feet first because then it's easier for you to see the need for more dark. So I'm going to do the toenails first. And I'm putting the dark at the bottom because that's where the shadow will be. I'm really just leaving the top white. You can put some pencil on it if you want to, or you can just leave it white paper. It wouldn't matter. So you can see I'm going around the toenail and I'm just putting the shadow underneath. Thinking where my light is coming from, shadow underneath. And that's sufficient. My toes have now got tonal value and everything else they need. I'm going to use the dark sepia. I'm going to continue with the dark sepia to do the legs. The legs are quite dark in color according to my reference. Obviously, do bear in mind, not every reference is absolutely typical of a species of bird, and you should, in theory, work with a couple of references. But for this simple exercise, I think this will be quite sufficient. Nice sharp point with my dark sepia. And again, I'm thinking the darks underneath first, and I'm going to tickle up the dark sepia up into the pinky grey that I have put a small burnish over. And you can see that by doing that, my toenails are suddenly linked. When you look at this lot, they look a bit weird. Here, working just with that little bit of dark sepia underneath and tickling the tone up higher, I already have a bit of a link between my toenails and the rest. I can see where the darker areas need to be because I did put them in ever so slightly when I worked with the grey, if you remember back to that. So I'm going up here now, again with a dark line, and then I'm just blending it inwards by a millimeter or so. So the legs, because they are so delicate, they take a fair bit of pencil control. And underneath the tummy here, I just want to darken it slightly because obviously the tummy would be casting a fair shadow. Let's turn that around so you can have a look. We're going to do exactly the same on this other foot. Dark underneath. And this is where you can see, I'm sure you will appreciate how important it is to know exactly where your light is coming from. Because I know that my light is coming from the upper left, it's really, really easy for me to see where my shadows need to be. That does take a little practice, to be fair. So I'm just tickling it upwards, just blending it ever so slightly. The feet are not going to be the focal point, but they are sticking out in the front, so they do need to be reasonably believable. I always battle with birds' feet. I find they're always quite a challenge, and my feet always look a bit odd. But I think I'll be okay here. So exactly as I did on this leg, to make sure that it all links together now, I'm just going to think a little bit of extra tonal value up the back of the leg. Ever so gently. Try not to press too hard. Try not to make the legs fatter and fatter, which I know sounds a bit obvious, but it's easily done, believe you me. And then again, a little extra shadow, just worked in and under the belly part, because obviously the belly would be casting a little shadow. Let's turn those around and see if they make sense. They do make sense. And notice that because I've got this extra little bit of dark now under the belly, the white of the belly miraculously is looking lighter. Now your feet aren't quite finished because they've got little scales on them, but you don't want to overdo it. If you were doing a really detailed ornithological study, that would be different. But in all honesty, for an artwork like this, as long as the viewer can see that I've got the thought of a few little scales, it is enough. Notice I'm just using the dark sepia again, but pressing really, really gently. Just so that you can see the thought. The fact that the legs are not absolutely smooth. They've just got a few little scales. Right, now I'm going to just increase the tonal value slightly on this part of the bird. Again, just working with the dark sepia. And this kind of thing, you can't really decide until you've done everything else. The legs are now complete, and I can see there is room for a little extra tonal value. So very, very gently with my dark sepia, this way and that, I just want to increase the tonal value slightly. And particularly along this area, because this area is going to be quite shadowed by my trompe-l'oeil effect when I go and put it in. So just tickle, tickle, tickle this way and that, but being mindful of trying not to lose the texture, which I know at this stage is now starting to get quite difficult. And I'm also going to increase just a little more here and there at the lower part of my bird. But as you saw up here, you don't need many lines. So I'm working with a very gentle pressure, lovely sharp point, and I'm just tickling in a few extra strokes here and there. I don't need to go all the way around, but at the lower end here, just a few extra strokes. Let's just have a look at that. That immediately is looking better. Now, on the little robin, you often in this area get a subtle brown ochre kind of color. So once I've done all my tonal value, I'm just going to go in with my brown ochre, nice sharp point, and very gently, same stroke, just a wash of brown ochre. Now I do it gently so that as I work my way along, should I feel the need to put another wash in inverted commas, I can. But if you notice already, and it's a few random strokes, still the crissy-crossy action, I don't need a whole lot more. That already is actually giving me quite a nice blush of brown ochre color. And it's just sufficient. Just a little more down there. And again, remember, this kind of thing can vary slightly bird to bird. I think I could do with just a few more dark lines in here. And I would say at this stage, that is pretty much my little bird complete. I may need to darken this area more once I have put the trompe-l'oeil effect around it. But at this stage, I would think that my robin is more or less done. So if you had decided you didn't want the trompe-l'oeil effect and you were simply going to put a branch, that would be your robin done and dusted, really. It's still got lovely fluffy texture. It looks quite soft. There's sufficient tonal value. There's sufficient depth to the feather. There's not a huge amount of detail here, but there is enough detail that you can see there's variation within the wing. And we're now ready to start the trompe-l'oeil. We're going to consider how you go about creating the trompe-l'oeil effect. You're going to use graphite pencils. I personally find it much easier to do this effect because we're going to do quite a simple effect. We're not going in for a whole lot of fiddly bits and pieces, simply using a graphite pencil. Now, I'm inclined to use the Caran d'Ache graphite pencils. They come in a tin like this. They're fabulous. They come from 4H all the way through to 9B, which is what I have here, a 9B. I find them a beautiful pencil, but there are loads and loads around. What is really good about these, as you can see from the top there, your very hardest pencil, your 4H, the outer paint is lightest. And as you work towards your 9B, the paint is darker. So it really makes it easy when you open the pencils and you pour them out to be able to pick up the one that you tonally need without having to actually look at the name. So I've got out my 9B, and I also have out my 4B, and I have a paper stump. And you will see as I go along that this makes life so much easier. Now, do be aware, graphite smudges very easily. So you need to be careful. And this is why I prefer to do the bird first and then the graphite. Now, I'm also going to work on the inside first so that anything I have on the outside is not going to smudge. I need to have a reasonably sharp point to begin with. So I'm going to go in and very carefully around my robin put a layer of my 9B graphite. This could be done with colored pencil. You don't have to use graphite, but the graphite I find smudges more easily on the outer edges. You will understand what I'm saying as I go along. You can see I'm working quite gently and delicately. I'm not drawing a straight line around unless needs be. Next to the leg, I will draw a straight line. But parts where it's fluffy, I'm working back into the fluff. This is quite a time-consuming, exacting thing to do. You could, if you were very good with a paintbrush, you could actually simply paint it on the inside. Or perhaps use a marker pen or something like that. I prefer to use the graphite, but it's only a personal thing. As I say, you could use colored pencil, most definitely. You could put colored pencil over the graphite if that's what you preferred. So I'm going to work my way around my robin, and I invite you to watch me. So as you can see, I've now gone around the entire robin using my 9B pencil because I wanted a really dark outer area. It pops the little robin out beautifully. But as I've warned you, graphite smudges so easily. So before I continue on, I need to just go in and clean up any areas that look too dreadful. Now, you could have done that with colored pencil, and you could put different colors over the top, even at this stage, if you felt you wanted a subtle variation in the background. I don't think I do. I want it to be strong and dark and black because it does pop the little robin forward. But now you're going to see how we're going to introduce the other shadows, and this is where, in my opinion, graphite comes into its own because it smudges so much more easily than colored pencil. So although, yes, it smudges easily, and that's why you've got to be super careful, it allows a much more delicate blend of tones. But let me just clean up what I can so that I'm not going to make too much mess as I go along. Even my bit of tracing paper has become quite grubby, so I'll just clean that up as well. Your kneadable eraser is marvelous for that. It really, really is. And do keep your hand on the paper at all times so that you don't make a dreadful mess. Okay, so now let's have a look and see the next step. Let's look at our reference. Right, so far so good. The little bird's popping forward quite nicely. Let me have a look at the reference to my hole. I apologize for the strange color, but my printer was doing weird things. Okay, my light is coming over my left shoulder. So I need to consider these edges of these. How do I show a subtle shadow in them? And this is where your stump can be extremely helpful. And even the fact that I've just got a little graphite on the stump allows me to actually get the beginnings of some shadow onto this piece of paper as it is. So you don't even need to really put much pencil on. I will put a little on, but I don't need to put much because the graphite that I have on my stump, which I used here and there to help smooth things out, is actually almost sufficient. And this is where the graphite comes into its own. Your paper stump is a very, very useful thing when you are working in graphite. I'm just keeping an eye on my reference and I can see which side is shadowed. Now, obviously, you could go into a huge amount of detail when you are doing this to actually really show the tears in the paper. But for this simple exercise, I don't think that is absolutely necessary. We're going to lift little bits out here and there as well. Now, I want just a little bit more. I'm going to, because I've got a very dark area there, I'm working now with my 4B. I'm going to put a little 4B in, but I'm leaving a subtle area of reflected light simply because it's easier then to see. And because I've rubbed a little graphite on already, when I put the 4B on, it takes quite nice and smoothly. Just gently, just adding a little extra. And where this can be useful is if you want to just define the edges slightly. Obviously, your paper stump is a bit big and is not going to give you a particularly well-defined edge. So if you want to define the edges just slightly, that's where it's quite useful to be able to go in with the pencil. You can get finer paper stumps too, so you can actually get a bit of extra definition. Once I have put the pencil in, and again it's about blending, and this time it's quite a smooth blend as opposed to the actual robin, which was quite fluffy and so on. I can go back with my paper stump just gently, picking up a little bit of that I have just laid in and just pulling it through, and it softens the whole effect. Now, colored pencil will smudge to a degree, but it doesn't quite smudge as effectively as graphite does. And you will see when we work further on and we're trying to cast shadows, it works even better. Right, let me just pop a little shadow in here or there, just to break up the illusion of the paper. And then some areas I may want to lift out almost completely so that I have got lost edges. Again, that is an optional thing. You don't have to do that. So this area here where I don't want a line, and yet there's just enough there for the viewer to see that it does actually belong to the same thing. I had to draw a line in because obviously you needed to see where I was going. But by giving yourself a slight lost edge there, it can be quite effective. You can see here how my little bit of reflected light is also quite effective. But the paper stump again can allow you to lessen that or make it more so as needs be. Right, let's get on to this one now. And again, what I'm going to do is simply work with the graphite that is on the stump already. I could pick up a little bit from here if I wanted and just pull it into this fold of paper. The edge of this fold is quite light, but I can't have all of it being particularly light because you won't see it against the white of the paper. Let me go in with my 4B. You could choose a 3B or a 2B, that would also be fine. Bear in mind when you are using graphite, each make of pencil has got slightly different grades. This particular make, the Caran d'Ache, is very soft. Some of them are a little harder. It's neither right nor wrong, it just is as it is. So just be aware that sometimes some makes of pencil are harder than other makes of pencil. And consequently, you'll just get a slight variation in the tone. Remember, when you are working with graphite, you're actually only thinking tone. In other words, you're only thinking lights and darks. You're really not thinking anything else. So I'm just working my way along here. I'm going to have to define that tip slightly because I'm on white paper. This exercise can be done on different colors. With a little practice, it really does become a very versatile exercise to consider. You may not overdo it, but it really does become a versatile exercise. And again, with your stump, you can vary the pressure. So there can be some areas where you press a little more firmly. And then there's other areas where you're not pressing hard at all. And then there's other areas like this where I can almost remove that and I have a lost edge. Let me turn that around so you can see. And those are looking quite nice as it is. If you have inadvertently gone a little too hard in some areas, do bear in mind your kneadable eraser is invaluable when working with graphite. I want to just show you one of these cast shadows now as I work my way around, but I want to show you a cast shadow. So let's just bring this across. Do you see that cast shadow now? I know I'll need to define the edge there, but let's just go in. That part is quite light, but underneath is where we've got this fabulous shadow coming. So I'm going to use my 4B just to define my edge. With shadows, it's always quite interesting. The shadow that is closest to the object is stronger, and then it blends away. And that's where your paper stump can be so helpful. And the graphite blends a whole lot easier than the colored pencil. So I've gone in with a bit of 4B, and then I'm picking up that 4B on my paper stump, and I'm blending it outwards. I can go back and put more on this area if I need to. But you can see that this blend I'm creating down here, allowing it to be quite soft as it disappears into the white paper, it gives you a really, really good soft edge. If we just again compare it, you can see how those edges are so incredibly soft and diffuse. And this is what working with the graphite does. I'm going to go in with just a tickle of 9B because I just want to strengthen it fractionally, closest to the actual fold of paper. But like anything, always tickle gently. You can go back and put another layer. So working with graphite pencil is a fabulous medium to use. It really, really is. But it's again, you are working with a pencil, and I prefer to work lighter and then darken up because you're not likely to make as many botches. The graphite can stain the paper. So that's why I prefer to go in lighter first. Use the paper stump to pull a little bit of that lower down if I want it stronger. With a paper stump, you can press as firmly or as gently as suits you. You look at what you are creating, and that is what you, if you're happy with how it's turning out, then that's fine. That's where you stop. I think I can make a little bit of a bulge there. That would probably look a bit better. But you can see those lovely soft edges that I am able to create, which is really, really a challenge to do if you're working in the colored pencil. You just don't get the blend as easily. Right, so as you can see here, this edge is now quite well defined, but what are we going to do about that edge? If you look at the reference, let's just whip that across, you can see there is a very small shadow there, a slight variation. So let's just go and tickle in the smallest amount of pencil to help us define that edge. Obviously, with an exercise like this, really and truly, you can more or less put shadow where you like it. Because unless somebody's got the exact piece of paper in front of them, they don't know if you've made an adjustment or not. So I'm going to use the stump and rely on the fact that I have a fair bit of graphite actually on the stump. Just to be able to define that edge ever so slightly, and then pull it out as far as I need to. So I can just pull it out a little bit, ever so softly. If your stump is getting too dirty, use your kneadable eraser to clean it. Really useful. You can use a piece of sandpaper if you wish to really get all the dirt off. So you can see by doing that, I've now just shown up that edge. As you do it, this foot has got shadow underneath it. So again, I'm going to use the graphite. Little bit under the toe. And I'm just tickling it in to begin with. I can go back and make it darker if I feel the need. I may not need to. I have mentioned that rather do it slowly because you can always add more if you want to. Now, shadows in themselves are quite an interesting thing to create, and sometimes they require really careful observation. These are a bit of a guess really, but unless the actual viewer has got the object in front of them, they wouldn't know whether I've guessed it or not, I'm sure. I think it'll do. And you can see just by putting that little shadow under the foot, it's made all the difference. Suddenly the bird appears to be sitting on my piece of paper. One thing I must make mention of is that graphite, apart from smudging really easily, also unfortunately does shine. Now you can now get graphite pencils that are supposedly non-shine. Myself, I have not yet tried them, but supposedly you can get them, which would really be useful because you may not see it too badly on the video. Yeah, you can see it a bit if I twist it around. Graphite does shine. And on some of the scans of this, it's a bit too shiny. Right, those shadows there are quite diffuse because that little toe is sticking out. But you can see how easy it is to get these shadows to work when you are working with graphite. As I say, the colored pencil works absolutely fine, but it does not blend and smudge quite as easily as this. And because of that, I like to use the graphite. But really, it's your own choice. I'm just creating the illusion of a little slit down here, thinking the paper's torn. Obviously, if you wanted to put a lot more detailing on your bits of paper, you could put a lot more detailing. Some of these edges here I need to actually just get rid of because I don't want a line. Your biggest challenge when you are doing something like this is to try not let it have any outlines. So anywhere where I have drawn it a little bit too vigorously, I drew it vigorously for the purposes of the video so that you could actually see it. But anywhere where I have drawn it a little too vigorously, it should really be lightened because it'll look better. So as I work my way along, I'll give it a little bit of prior thought, and I will possibly lighten areas anyway, rather than have to go back and rub, although it's not the end of the world. For example, this edge here could be quite a bit lighter. It's going to be a bit like that. It's going to catch the light in places. So if I just lighten it a little now, before I actually start adding the pencil, it's probably going to be a good idea. So I'll lighten that all just a little bit now. And then I can again pick up more or less what is here and just carry it over. All you've got to do is keep an eye on the reference and see where the shadows are or aren't. You can make subtle adjustments yourself. You don't have to copy the reference exactly because no one else is going to have the reference in front of them. Only you will. You've got to define the edge slightly, but perhaps this edge, because it's curling back and catching the light quite a bit, it's perhaps going to be almost the palest of any of the edges, and that's where that little bit from the paper stump, the little bit of graphite from the paper stump, is just so useful. And you can create sort of the illusion of a bit of a fold in the paper because no one's going to have it in front of them. Now this actually casts a bit of a shadow down here as well, I've just noticed. So I can go and put a little bit of a shadow on this side, on the outside. So not only is there a small amount of shadow inside, but there's actually a bit of shadow outside as well. And it's all because the light is coming from the upper left. And if you just think it through logically, that's how the shadow is created. When I actually took that photograph, this photograph, I had pinned a piece of paper with a hole in up on a screen, and I took a photograph with the light coming over my left shoulder so that the light was appropriate. And that is how I cast the shadows. Right, so we'll just rub a little extra here. I'm losing a little bit of those shadows that I put in, but it's not a problem because I can go and put them back. It becomes quite diffuse, this shadow, as it works its way outwards, and that's where the stump is fabulous. So if I just tickle a little bit extra here, remember I had that sort of shadow coming from the toe that was floating because it's sort of sticking out. It really is a simple method of achieving basically a very realistic effect. That looks absolutely fine, I think. Just is enough for that shadow. If there are any areas that you do not like or you feel you could alter them, your kneadable eraser is really fabulous for just breaking up areas. Because the kneadable eraser takes off the graphite so efficiently, It really is a useful thing to have. Okay, so I'm going to invite you to watch me as I complete these remaining 3 folds of paper. Now that all the really dark trompe-l'oeil effect has been applied, you, I am quite sure, are well aware that some of the tonal areas on the bird could be a little stronger. This often happens when you are working with a particularly dark background. Next to some of the darks on the bird, they could be darker. So if I have a look here in particular, I think I need to go in with a little bit more dark sepia. And remember, I did darken this area quite a bit, but looking at it now, I need to darken more, because otherwise this particular area is going to look too light and is going to pull the eye away from where you want the eye to be pulled, to actually dwell, which is on the bird, the head of the bird, rather than the tail end of the bird. So that you can see by just darkening that somewhat, it immediately recedes it behind my illusion of paper. I think this area as well could do with some darkening. So what I am almost encouraging as I darken these areas are small areas of dark lost edges, like that, almost the edge becomes so dark it disappears into the dark of the background. Now, again, obviously that's absolutely optional. It depends on you and how you feel you want your artwork to look. But I quite like the effect of darkening it so that it almost gets lost and disappears. Now, I need to add a little further dark here, and I'm sure you can notice it. It'll be yelling at you that although you thought there was quite a lot of dark on the tum, by the time I've added that dark background, it really does need a little extra. So I'm just going to go in, first of all, with the dark grey. I may use a little dark sepia, and I'm just going to go along the bottom. Now, doing these final sort of finishing off touches, I might actually be pulling a little graphite into the coloured pencil work. It really doesn't matter, because I want to darken it anyway. So just a little bit at the bottom there, coming up slightly higher as needs be. This area here, I think I can probably start darkening it with dark sepia, not necessarily pressing as firmly as what I did there, because that I wanted to disappear. This I don't want to disappear, but I do need it tonally darker. And many times when you add a dark background, you will see this happening. You have to go back and just tweak a little bit of the tonal areas in the actual image. And it's usually the darker bits that need to just have a tiny bit more added to them. That's looking better now, because now that's starting to recede into the background, as I suggested. I need a little bit more up the top here even. So I'm going to just stick with the dark sepia. But to make sure my bird looks rounded, I'm just going to tweak a little bit, ever so gently, because I don't want to go and make a great big dark blob, but just ever so gently, I'm just going to tweak the odd little line of dark sepia actually into the red feather. And it just helps tactfully round the bird a little more. You may have noticed, and that I have done deliberately. I'll show you now. Sorry, I talk ahead of what I'm doing. Let me just finish that little bit down there. Whatever you're doing, whenever you do this flicking, please remember to go this way and that. You may have noticed that when I put the dark background, I left the smallest amount of reflected light at the bottom of the beak. Now that I did deliberately, because remember, I want the viewer to look here. Head and neck. That is definitely not a dark lost edge, whereas here I have deliberately got a dark lost edge. So that tiny little bit of reflected light there was deliberate. And it's what I mean as you go along, and as a thinking artist, how you make these just subtle variations. It's small stuff, but I just think it makes a difference. Perhaps the viewer is not quite sure what you've done, and in fact the viewer shouldn't really be able to. None of the adjustments and finishing touches should really yell at the viewer. They should just wonder why it works so well, we hope. Right, I think I can just put a few extra little darks in there even. That, I think, is looking better. And I would consider, really, I don't think there's a whole lot more that you need to do. You could play around some of these other little rubbings that you've done. Perhaps you could use your stump a bit more here and there. But the shadows from the actual folds of paper don't have to be absolutely accurate, although you could spend time and make them so if you felt you wanted to. There is no right or wrong. It's as you feel works best for you. You can see that within these highlighted areas, using the paper stump, I have just tickled the odd little bit of a sort of a mark to make it look as if it's quite soft paper that has been folded back. As I said at the very beginning, please bear in mind that this technique is an optional extra. You really don't have to do it. You could simply have had a little stick for your bird to sit on and it would have been beautiful. However, I thought it was quite nice to show you just a little quirk, a bit of humor, because it makes it a bit different, doesn't it? If something like that's framed and on a wall, certainly it kind of attracts the eye. But aside from all of my waffle, I would honestly say that this artwork is now complete. To complete my robin and make it more Christmassy, I decided to use a stencil and a little gold acrylic paint. And simply the stencil had snowflakes on it, and I used a little bit of acrylic paint, and I simply very carefully worked my way around the robin, adding a little bit of a stenciled festive sort of seasonal kind of effect. Obviously entirely optional. The artwork was designed to be a trompe-l'oeil robin, but I decided to add a seasonal twist. You may want to do the same.